Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Ben, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about books that I have recently finished reading. And I've got three of them. All three of these I read in August. So I'm a little bit late with these videos, but I'm finally getting to them. So I'll just go in the order in which I read them. First, with First Principles. So this is a nonfiction history book. I read this for Historathon. Historathon is a year-long reading event where we are discussing, celebrating, and just overall having fun with nonfiction history. And we've divided the year up into 4 quarters, with each quarter looking at a certain time period. This quarter, quarter 3, which will be ending at the end of September, we are looking at 1500 to 1820. And as part of that, one of my co-hosts and also a frequent commenter, subscriber, Stephanie, the co-host being John David, we decided that we would buddy read First Principles, what America's founders learned from the Greeks and Romans and how that shaped our country, by Thomas E. Ricks. I believe this was at the suggestion of John David, but I had this sitting on my shelf anyway, and this is something that Steffi and I had talked about reading at some point. We have been reading for the past couple of years some buddy reads of ancient history, especially the ancient historians. So this is something that came up at some point during those buddy reads. So I was glad to finally get to it. It was nice to have an excuse. I wasn't planning on reading this originally in August, but nevertheless, I'm glad that I was able to take it off my shelf and read. That's not to say that this is a great book. All of us had our problems with it. Now, Ricks is, I guess, probably best known for his book Fiasco, about I think it's on the back here, the American military adventure in Iraq, which I have not read yet, but I think it's supposed to be pretty good. So I was looking forward to this, and especially the promise of the subtitle here, right? What America's founders learned from the Greeks and Romans and how that shaped our country. The problem is that that's not really what you get. Right from the very beginning, in his introduction, first of all, he talks about what prompted him to write this, and it was essentially something of a of crisis after the election of Donald Trump, feeling that we had gone very, very far from our founding principles, and he wanted to get back to finding out what it was. So basically, what was it that influenced the founders? Now, this would lead you to believe, this subtitle, that we're going to focus on the classics, although we stray from that quite often. Instead, in the introduction, he posits it as more of what was the early education of the first 4 presidents. So we've got Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, and they're the main focus, although some other people do get some mention here. So automatically we're straying from this because 3 of them had some formal classical education, but Washington did not. So whenever we're talking about Washington, we are not talking about what really they learned from the Greeks and Romans. So we end up having long stretches of this book that deal with Washington that they feel like detours that we're taking. There's a very long section where it goes through George Washington's experiences in the French and Indian War, and then again during the American Revolution as a military commander. Now, the problem is that he's not drawing on the classics here in any of those situations. So you're kind of left scratching your head wondering why we're spending so much time with it. It's not that that stuff isn't interesting. I mean, by itself, that stuff is really interesting. But you feel like you're constantly swaying from, the presumed thesis of the book. And he does try to connect things back to the classical world at times, but it is not entirely successful or convincing. I mentioned at one point to John David that, when they talk about the tactics that Washington used against the British, especially after the first part of the war, basically avoiding a direct confrontation with this overwhelmingly stronger enemy, and following it, harassing it, destroying its supply lines, and it's described as Fabian tactics after Fabius, who went against Hannibal Barca in a very similar way. You can call it Fabian tactics all you want, but the problem is that Washington didn't get those tactics by learning it from Fabius, by reading about Fabius. Instead, he got it just through experience, and he ended up falling into the same or a very similar type of tactic because it worked. And he was not the last person to do it. He was not the first person to do it. People using Fabian tactics all throughout history. Just because it tends to be, named after a Roman general does not mean that this is a lesson from the classical world. We have other instances of like trying to compare John Adams to Cicero. Washington is also compared to people like Cato or Cincinnatus, at different times. And yeah, he knew about some of these people through plays and, just basically through their popular culture at the time, because those stories would have been told, but it doesn't mean he's learning them. So that's one problem. We're constantly straying away from that proposed central thesis. And then to double down on that, it does feel like the book keeps changing its mind of what it wants to be. So by the second half of the book, it really felt like it was really more about not what they learned from the classics and how it shaped our country, but rather, I would almost say, a death of classicism and a triumph of the Enlightenment. He starts contrasting the two. And it seems like the real focus here should have been, how did those classical lessons, which ones succeeded and maybe which ones fell by the wayside once they had to actually start governing, and start drawing from other points in time and, other, prior experiences from writers and civilizations. That seems to be what it really should have been about. And then he ends the book with, it's what did he call it here? Epilogue, what we can do. He's trying to say basically that if we go back to what the founders learned from, if we go back to the classics, we'll somehow maybe find ourselves again. And he has a list of things that we should do that would help us improve the country and get back on track. And, I pretty much agree with the things that he's saying in here, but I don't understand what they have to do with American classes, with the Greeks and the Romans and the things that came before it. The last chapter feels like one big non sequitur, and somehow we're supposed to be seeing a tie there that just doesn't. It's not there. Let me just say that. I would say also, John David, he wrote he filmed a review of this, and I'll leave a link if I remember to his review, and it's going to echo quite a bit. He kind of describes it as a lot of copy and paste biography, and I would agree with that. And when we do get some little lessons in the classical world, it is very much surface level. It doesn't really go into it, and we're not showing from the author a deep understanding of the classical world that the founders were drawing from. And sometimes I don't think we're really finding a deep understanding of the founders. I found one thing that kept getting in the way of my enjoyment of this was his obvious distaste for like Thomas Jefferson. Some of the passages in here just feel so backhanded and kind of unfair, overly harsh in a way. He has one section where after this long, many pages of talking about Washington and his Fabian tactics, we have a couple paragraphs about Jefferson, and they focus on Jefferson, fleeing Monticello because the British were coming. And he's basically contrasting that with Washington, and it makes it, Jefferson look like a coward by comparison. But I'm just thinking, what was Jefferson supposed to do? Was he supposed to let himself get caught? I mean, would being hanged be something that Washington would have allowed himself to do? I don't think so. It's just kind of a very unfair treatment, and he's mining some quotes from people who are overly harsh, I think, to people like Jefferson. And even when he does use primary sources and quotes, I'm not always convinced that they're being used the right way. He talks about how he's using an awful lot a digital database of the founders and the things that they wrote. And I get the impression sometimes that you kind of search for keywords and pull out some quotes and use them in here, but I don't think that they're entirely used accurately. At one point, it seems like he's going against Jefferson, and he's taking out quotes from a very famous letter that he wrote to was it Maria Cosway, if I'm remembering correctly, about the head versus the heart. It's one of his most famous letters, and Rick seems to draw the wrong conclusion about what Jefferson is actually saying because he's taking quotes out of context. And I'm afraid that this might have happened more than once inside the book. So, I don't want to keep talking about it at this point. I wish it was better. I love the idea here. And it's not that I hated the process of reading the book, but I did get frustrated a lot. And ultimately, I wasn't entirely sure if I can trust the assessment. So it's not something I can recommend. I enjoyed reading it with John David and with Stephanie. I love having, smart, critical people to bounce ideas and observations off of. So even if a book is bad, that makes the experience worthwhile. So I want to thank them for, letting me join them in that buddy read that we did. But this is not something I can recommend, unfortunately. I wish I could, but it's a little bit of a dud for me. Okay, the next two are a lot lighter. They are both things that I read for Book Trek 2023. So Book Trek is a yearly event that I created that I've got some great co-hosts for, where we read Star Trek fiction. And this year was the summer of Trek. So for June, July, and August, we read Star Trek fiction. But we also have optional away missions. And the two optional away missions this time were to read a nonfiction science book, which I unfortunately did not get time to do. I think that if I didn't read this, that's what I would have read. I would have read my nonfiction science book. I had been eyeing Carl Sagan's The Varieties of Scientific Experience, actually, for the month of August. But like I said, I wanted to jump into that buddy read and have the opportunity to read this. So I didn't get to a science book. But the other optional away mission were reading books, basically connected to Trek. They could be books that were written by people from Star Trek. Like here we got Brent Spiner fan fiction. They could be biographies about the actors or production history. We've got some other fiction here that connects to Trek. So basically, it's stuff about Trek, but it's not technically Trek fiction. So that's what I did here. So the first one that I read was Night of the Living Trekkies. And I think most of my other co-hosts, read this as well. I'm pretty sure that Brandy from the Book Collective did, and read by Fred. And I think Gareth might have as well. He might have also read this. So, first of all, I just want to admire that cover. That's a fantastic cover to have. And I love the the yellow cover, which I haven't looked into it. Is this meant to mimic the kind of thrillers from the 1960s that often came in yellow covers? Isn't that what Giallo is pretty much named after? The Italian cinema? I could be wrong about that, but I might just be misremembering. I'll check it after I'm done filming to see, but if I'm mistaken, I'll just leave my mistake in here and people will know. But anyhow, I appreciate this, and it's got a cool, I like this. We got that there. It's a very nice presentation. Okay, and we have an obvious love for Star Trek in here. Each of the chapters is named after a Star Trek episode. We essentially have a Star Trek convention going on in Houston. It seems to just be beginning. Our main character is a guy named Jim Pike. That should give you an indication of what we're dealing with here. You have a Jim Pike. If you know anything about Star Trek, you know exactly what that is referencing, or two things that's referencing. And there's a zombie infection outbreak that happens, and we see it basically play out through this hotel, this Houston hotel, where our main character Jim Pike he's a bellhop basically, but before that he was a soldier who did multiple tours in Afghanistan. So he's got military experience, and we're seeing things play out and people trying to survive. So just to the bare basics, this is a very basic, fairly predictable zombie infection narrative. So it is, though, more of a horror book than a Trek book. So there is tons of Trek references in here, though. And they range from the kind of clever and funny to the cringy. It's thrown in there a lot. Like I said, Jim Pike. Okay, so that's, James T. Kirk and Christopher Pike put together here. The references are very on the nose. It's reading this, not a page goes by where they don't try and squeeze something Trek in there. And it can get a little bit exhausting sometimes. Sometimes it feels a little bit inappropriate. Sometimes it feels forced. It did end up sometimes, quite often, as I was reading this, I kept having that image of, I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, but it's the meme of Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the TV excitedly, like he's recognizing something. Now, that's what I felt like this was. It's like, oh, I know that reference. Ooh, I know that reference. And I guess that's really it. I mean, you get a very basic zombie narrative out of here. These people trying to survive. Some of it's pretty well done. Some of it is a little bit, we have tons and tons of Trek references. Although, I guess my biggest criticism with this sort of thing, and I had fun with it. I'm not saying I didn't have fun, and I would recommend it to Trek fans, only Trek fans. Though. I don't think anybody else would really appreciate it. I recommend to Trek fans, but I wish it actually felt more Trek. There's a lot of lip service done to Trek, and there's a lot of like kind of trivia things and a lot of references to different characters and shows, but I wish that it felt a little bit more in the spirit of Trek. Instead, it's much more negative and a downer. It's much more of a horror book with a lot of Trek stuff thrown in. But it would be nice if we saw these characters basically, trying to use science more to figure out how to get out of their situation, or embracing a certain amount of infinite diversity. Basically, using the philosophy of Trek in various ways to overcome. Instead, it ends up being a lot of basically cutting things heads off, but you're wearing a Star Trek uniform. So, okay, that's fine. I can have fun with that, but it's not going to make a list of favorites for me. So, I enjoyed this overall. Like I said, I would recommend it to Trek fans, but that's about it. And then lastly, I read fan fiction by Brent Spiner. And Brent Spiner, of course, played Data on Star Trek Next Generation. This came out in 2021. Okay, so it says a Mem-Noir inspired by true events. So there you go. You got Brent Spiner there. Star Trek The Next Generation is my favorite iteration of Star Trek. I like most of them, but Next Gen is basically my favorite. And this was a lot of fun. It begins actually with some autobiography or memoir from Brent Spiner about how he got into the show and some background into some of his theater days and his early growing up. But then it makes a left turn into a fictional version of the past. So this takes place in mid-show run of Next Generation, in which Brent Spiner is playing Commander Data, and he starts receiving threatening pieces of mail from somebody claiming to be his daughter Lal. Lal was a daughter that his character Data created in one of the episodes, The Offspring. And this sort of crazed fan is claiming to be her and sending bloody objects and dangerous, weaponry and crazy threats through the mail. And he's basically trying to cope. He's trying to get help. He's trying to figure out, Brent's trying to figure out what's going on. And he's often getting the assistance of his castmates. So everybody ends up appearing in here as well that you love from Trek. You got Patrick Stewart, Jonathan Frakes, LeVar Burton, Michael Dorn, Marina Sirtis, Gates McFadden. They all appear in here. And but what's funny is that they're fictional versions of themselves. I have to imagine, because I know that this is a cast that has kept very close to each other over the years. I have to imagine that Brent Spiner was writing these people in a way that he knew would make them laugh. There's probably little kernels of truth somehow in these things, but they're all exaggerated versions of themselves. They're fictionalized versions. So LeVar Burton is like super mystical new agey to a ridiculous degree. Patrick Stewart is he's very like fun and sweet, but he's also he's got some really hilarious lines. He was one of the funniest things. Like basically Brent Spiner talks about how British actors are also trained in the martial arts to defend themselves, and there's these weird little things that he'll throw in there that are basically delivered with a straight face. And I will say, I didn't just read this by itself. I listened to, and I went back and forth. That's how I usually do audiobooks. I always go back and forth with the actual content. The audiobook version of this, which has a full cast. So you actually get to hear Patrick Stewart and Michael Dorn and LeVar Burton, Jonathan Frakes and them, all of them. And it's a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed the production of that. It's very high production. And I think that you'll get a lot of the humor that Brent Spiner is going for. This is not meant to be realistic. This is meant to be a fictional version of his past. So you have these two very, very attractive twins who are helping him. One of them is an FBI agent, and the other one's a bodyguard. It's Candy and Cindy, I believe, were the names. They're not meant to be real. They're not meant to be believable in any way. They're kind of there to provide for a lot of jokes. And in this case, the jokes here work a lot better than they did for me in here. It's a fairly short read. It's not very long at all. It goes by pretty quick. I definitely was laughing out loud at different parts. And if somebody's a Trek fan, especially a Next Generation fan, I would absolutely recommend this. Just know what you're getting into. This is meant to be a humorous mystery. It's not meant to be, really taken seriously in just about any way. But if you go with the right attitude, I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. So I really enjoyed this. So that's it. Those are the last 3 books that I finished in August of 2023. They were, let's see, First Principles, which I can't really recommend. Night of Living Trekkies, which I would only recommend to Star Trek fans, and Brent Spiner's fan fiction, which I would recommend to Trek fans and just people who like humorous books. But you do have to know some of the Trek from that to really appreciate, I think, what he's trying to do. But if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.